Okay, gotta admit, you've given us a real challenge this time around with this topic.
Oh.
Measuring ethical progress. I mean, wow, that's something that's kept philosophers busy for centuries, you know? But you've sent us this really interesting collection of research papers and articles all trying to do just that.
It's a huge topic for sure.
It is. So
Yeah.
think of this as our deep dive, you know, into how we even try to measure something as slippery as ethics
Yeah.
for individuals, but also for entire societies.
What I find so fascinating about this whole thing is that the tools we use to try to measure this progress are always changing.
Right.
And it reflects how our own understanding of morality shifts and changes over time.
Like we're chasing a moving target or something.
Yeah, in a way, we've gone from these really rigid ancient codes to frameworks that are way more complex today.
Yeah.
Like now we have to consider things like human rights and global justice and even the ethics of AI, which is a whole other can of worms.
It really feels like our idea of what even counts as ethical behavior shifts like every generation.
Definitely does.
So let's start with the individual.
Okay.
One of the sources you sent over mentions this thing called the Defining Issues Test, or DIT.
Yeah.
And it's meant to try to figure out a person's moral reasoning. Have you ever taken one of these tests?
I have, yeah, and they're pretty interesting.
Really?
Yeah, they give you all these moral dilemmas, much like that really famous one, the Heinz dilemma.
Oh, yeah.
And then it analyzes like how you prioritize different values when you have to make a choice.
Oh, right. The Heinz dilemma. That's the one where it's like, do you steal the drug to save your dying wife, or do you follow the law? A classic. But this DIT thing goes beyond just like a yes or no answer, right?
Right.
It actually tries to get into the reasoning, like, why did you pick that choice?
Exactly. It's trying to gauge the complexity of your moral reasoning, looking at how you balance competing principles, like justice versus compassion versus individual rights.
So give me an example.
Okay. So someone who scores high on the justice scale might decide that no matter what, upholding the law is the most important thing.
Even in a situation like with the Heinz dilemma.
Even in a dire situation.
Huh. Okay, so then how does a test like that actually help us measure like real, moral progress? Because knowing what the right thing to do is and actually doing it,
Oh, yeah.
those are two completely different things.
That's a great point. It's the million-dollar question, and it's actually a question that moral foundations theory tries to answer.
Okay.
You heard of that one?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
Something about 5 core moral foundations.
Yeah, 5. Sounds kind of complicated.
It is kind of like baking a very complicated cake.
Okay.
Think of it this way. Each of us has these built-in moral foundations, like care and harm,
Yeah.
Fairness versus cheating, loyalty and betrayal, authority and subversion, and then sanctity and degradation.
Okay, so we've all got these, but they're different for each person.
Right. And how sensitive we are to each of these foundations affects our moral judgments and what actions we end up taking.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. So this theory explains why people might completely disagree about what's ethical,
Right.
even when they're both coming from a good place,
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, for example, someone who really values loyalty,
Yeah.
they might have a lot of trouble with the idea of whistleblowing, even if they see something wrong happening, in their company.
Right, because they don't want to betray the group.
Right, exactly.
Interesting.
And this understanding can actually help us have more productive conversations
Well, that's cool.
when we're dealing with really tricky ethical problems.
It's like we all speak different moral languages or something.
Yeah, you could say that.
But we share a lot of the same values, just expressed in different ways.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about individual ethics, but how do we measure ethical progress for a whole society? I mean, it can't just be everyone taking a test, right?
Right, it's got to be bigger than that.
Yeah.
It's like zooming out from the individual to the big picture.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So how do we zoom out?
Well, one way is to look at indices that measure things like a nation's well-being and how much social progress it's making.
Okay, so things like the Human Development Index,
Right.
which
yeah.
includes things like how long people live and education levels and, standard of living, stuff like that.
Exactly.
But isn't that a kind of roundabout way to try and measure ethics?
It is a bit indirect, but the thinking is that societies that really prioritize the well-being of all their citizens are probably more likely to be ethical.
I see the logic there.
But, like you said, a country can be super wealthy and still have a lot of inequality,
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And it could have systemic injustices too.
So we need something that goes beyond just economics.
Right.
And that looks more at a society's commitment to fairness and equality for everyone. Is
Yeah.
that where the Social Progress Index comes in?
Yes. The SPI
Okay.
measures things like access to healthcare and education and personal rights. It also looks at how tolerant a society is of diversity and the quality of the environment and the level of safety and security that people feel.
So it gives us a more complete picture of a nation's ethical landscape than just money.
Right. It's about how people are treated and whether their rights are respected.
But what about things like war and violence? I mean, those seem like pretty clear signs that a society is failing ethically, don't they?
Absolutely. And that's where something like the Global Peace Index comes in.
Ah, okay.
That one measures the level of violence, both within a country and between countries.
So like civil wars and wars between different nations.
Yeah. And things like how stable the government is and how much they spend on the military.
And human rights too, right?
Yes. All of that.
Wow. So it's like we've created all these ways to measure something as hard to pin down as a society's ethics.
He's gotten pretty good at it.
But can you really boil it all down to numbers? Does it really capture all the complexities of ethical progress?
That's the question, isn't it? I mean, these indices are really valuable.
Yeah.
But they do have limitations.
In what way?
Well, they might miss more subtle forms of discrimination, for example.
Ah, I see.
Or they might not take into account all the cultural differences that impact ethics.
That makes sense.
So that's why it's so important to go beyond just the numbers.
Okay.
And actually have these open, honest conversations.
About the ethical challenges we're facing.
Yeah, exactly.
So it seems like we've moved from ancient codes of conduct to modern-day indices and all these tests.
It's been quite a journey.
But the big question still remains. How do we close that gap between knowing what's right and actually building a more ethical world? And it makes me wonder how societies in the past even tried to answer that question.
Oh, they definitely did. And it's amazing how their approaches reflect what they valued and believed in back then.
That's so interesting.
So let's take a trip back in time and see how different cultures have dealt with this challenge.
I'm in. Let's rewind the clock and see what we can learn.
Let's go.
Yeah.
Okay, so imagine we're traveling back in time,
Okay.
all the way back to ancient Babylon, and there we find the Code of Hammurabi.
Okay.
One of the very first attempts to write down ethical behavior.
Oh, yeah. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. I remember learning about that in school.
Right, exactly. It was a pretty harsh system, though, wasn't it?
It sounds brutal, even for back then.
Yeah, it was very focused on punishment and revenge.
Yeah.
And keeping things in order. But what's interesting is they tried to create these clear rules to make sure everyone was treated fairly.
At least fairly by their standards.
Right, exactly. It's like this early try at creating a way to measure ethics, even if we don't agree with all of it today.
Yeah, like a very rough draft of a moral code.
Exactly. Now let's fast forward a bit,
Okay.
a few centuries to ancient Egypt.
Okay.
And they had this concept called Ma'at.
Mot.
Yeah, it represented truth and justice and cosmic order.
Cosmic order.
Yeah, it was a really big idea for them.
Hmm.
And it wasn't just a list of laws like the Hammurabi Code.
Okay.
It was more like a guiding principle for living an ethical life.
I see. So it was like a philosophy of life that encouraged ethical behavior.
Exactly. And it's interesting how both these civilizations connected being ethical with keeping things in order.
Right. Whether it was order in society or even order in the whole universe.
Yeah. Okay, now let's jump ahead again to the ancient Greeks.
The philosophers.
Yes, they were all about reason and virtue,
Yeah.
And they thought that becoming more ethical was like this personal journey of self-improvement.
Ah, like Socrates. He was always asking questions.
Oh, yeah, he was big on that.
Know thyself was his big thing.
Exactly. He thought that really examining your own beliefs and actions was the key to being a good person.
It's like looking into a mirror and asking yourself tough questions about whether you're living up to your own values.
That's a great way to put it. And this focus on self-reflection was important to the Stoics, too.
The Stoics?
Yeah, like Marcus Aurelius?
Oh, yeah.
They actually had this daily ritual they did called the evening reflection. Yeah, they'd go over everything they did that day and ask themselves, where did I mess up?
And how can I do better tomorrow?
Exactly. Like a self-performance review way before those became a thing.
And this idea of looking inward to track your moral progress kept going, even with the big religions, right?
Right. Think about confession in Christianity or repentance in Islam.
Yeah.
Those are rituals meant to make you really reflect on yourself and your actions.
Yeah.
you know?
So it's like all these different cultures and traditions had their own ways of getting people to think about their own ethics.
Yeah, and to hold themselves accountable.
But those were all focused on the individual, right? Like one person's journey.
That's true. But a lot of societies also had these group rituals or ceremonies.
Oh, okay.
They were kind of like a collective ethical check-in. You know?
Existing.
For example, a lot of indigenous cultures had rites of passage, where young people had to go through all these tests and challenges to learn the moral values of their community and how to be responsible members of that community.
Like a way to make sure the next generation is ready to uphold the ethical standards of the group.
Exactly. And in Confucian societies, they had festivals like King Ming, which is also called Tomb Sweeping Day.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, it wasn't just about remembering their ancestors. It was also a time for families to really think about their values and to think about their duties to the community.
So these rituals were like a bridge between personal ethics and the well-being of the whole group.
Right, and they showed how much they valued social harmony.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And let's not forget how powerful it can be just to talk things out, like debate and discuss.
Right.
The ancient Greeks, they had these gatherings called symposia.
Okay.
Where citizens would get together and argue about all these philosophical and ethical issues.
Sounds kind of intense.
Oh, it could be. But it was a way for them to challenge each other's ideas.
And refine their understanding of right and wrong.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of like a mix of a TED Talk and a town hall meeting.
I like that.
But were these gatherings only for like the rich and famous?
Yeah. Was it just the elite?
Well, it depended on the city-state. But the idea that public discussion was a way to explore ethical issues that spread.
Okay.
And this tradition of open debate continued in other cultures, too.
Like where?
Well, in medieval Islamic societies, for example.
Yeah.
Scholars would get together in these gatherings called majlis.
Majlis.
And they would have these really lively debates about religion and ethics.
So it sounds like this idea of ethical progress not being a solo mission is a really common theme.
Yeah, we need to hear other people's points of view.
To challenge our own assumptions.
And to help us figure out what's truly right and wrong.
Makes sense to me. And as we move closer to our own time, the modern era, we see this collective ethical reflection taking on new forms, right?
Right. Like think about protests and social movements.
Yeah.
They often challenge the way things are and demand more justice and equality.
It's like society looking at itself and saying, we can do better than this.
Exactly. And in democracies, we have things like elections and public debates.
Yeah.
Which can be messy and full of arguments, but they're a way for people to voice their moral concerns,
And to hold their leaders accountable.
Right. So we choose leaders who share our values, and if they don't live up to them, we let them know.
It's amazing to see how the ways we measure ethical progress have changed so much.
It really is.
From those ancient codes to modern-day indices, from looking inward to taking action as a group.
A lot of variety.
But with all these different approaches, how do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Right. Like what connects all these different ways of thinking about ethics?
It's really kind of mind-blowing to see just how much effort has gone into trying to define and measure something as slippery as, ethical progress.
It really is.
From ancient rituals to all these fancy modern-day metrics, it seems like we humans have always been trying to figure out how to be better.
Yeah.
Both on a personal level and as a whole society.
I think what's really interesting is that even though there are all these differences across cultures and time periods, there are still these common threads.
Oh, like what?
Well, they all point to this deeper understanding of what it means to actually make ethical progress.
Okay, now I'm intrigued. Tell me more about these common threads.
Okay, well, first off, almost every single method for measuring ethical progress depends on some kind of framework.
A framework?
Yeah, like a set of principles or guidelines that you use as a benchmark to see how you're doing.
So it's like having a moral compass.
Exactly. Something to help you navigate all the gray areas of right and wrong.
Like a moral GPS.
Yeah. And that framework could be anything, really.
Okay.
Could be a religious text or philosophy book or even just the unspoken rules of your culture.
But you got to have that starting point right.
Right. You need something to measure yourself against.
It's like having the ruler, but just having the ruler doesn't automatically make you a better person, does it?
No, it doesn't. And that brings us to the second common thread. The focus on practice and forming good habits.
Oh.
Whether it's that Stoic evening reflection we talked about, or the Buddhist emphasis on being mindful, or even the Confucian tradition of honoring your ancestors.
Yeah.
The main idea is that you become more ethical by consistently doing the right thing and thinking about your actions.
So it's not enough just to know the rules. You got to live them out, make them a part of who you are.
Exactly. It's like building moral muscle memory.
I love that. It makes ethical progress sound way less intimidating, you know?
Right.
Like it's a skill you can practice and get better at over time.
Exactly. And the last common thread, and maybe the most important one, is the role of community and dialogue.
Okay.
We rarely figure out our ethics all on our own.
Right.
We need to hear different perspectives.
To challenge our own ideas.
Yeah. And to learn from people who might see things differently than we do.
It's like that saying, iron sharpens iron, right? We need each other to grow.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that brings us full circle back to your original question.
How do we measure ethical progress?
Yeah. And even though all these tools and measurements are useful,
Yeah.
I think the real measure of progress is how willing we are to have those tough conversations,
Yeah.
to really look at our own beliefs and to try to create a world where everyone can thrive.
So it's less about getting a perfect score on some ethics test.
Way less.
And more about going on this journey of learning and growing.
It's a lifelong process.
Both as individuals and as a society.
Exactly. We have to be humble and open to new ideas and willing to admit when we're wrong.
Because making the world a more ethical place, that's a goal worth striding for.
Couldn't agree more.
Wow, this deep dive has been a whirlwind. We've gone from ancient codes to modern indices.
We've covered a lot of ground.
From how our brains make moral decisions to the big ethical questions facing our world.
It's complex.
And it's clear that measuring ethical progress is this really multifaceted thing that's always changing.
But it's a challenge worth tackling.
Absolutely. So what are your big takeaways from our conversation?
Yeah, what questions are still swirling around in your head?
I think for me, the biggest takeaway is that this isn't a new struggle. The
Yeah.
fact that humans have been wrestling with these questions for centuries shows that deep down, we really do care about creating a more ethical world.
That's a good point.
And even though the way forward isn't always crystal clear, the fact that we're even having these conversations, that we're reflecting on our actions, that's a sign of progress in itself.
I like that. Yeah. It's a hopeful way to look at it.
It is. It's a reminder that even though things are complicated and messy, we're all in this together.
We are.
Trying to figure it out as we go along.
And learning from our mistakes along the way.
Exactly. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into ethical progress. And until next time, keep those moral compasses pointed in the right direction.